Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 4, Asian Immigration in the United States from the earliest days through the 19th century. I'm not sure we can cover this all in one chapter, but we're going to. So that is a big ask. If you're really going to get into more detail, I'd recommend Eric Coolies' The Making of Asian American History, which is your textbook for the class, and that would be chapter 3, actually chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, all within this lecture. So I'm going to give you the abbreviated version, hit the most important highlights, which I want you guys to know. But of course, there is much more to that story, and Eric Lee's chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, really all that would inform this this lecture into much greater depth. But we only have so much time, so we're going to jump right in. Now, an important part of this is the previous lectures, as you guys were both introduction to the larger narrative of the class, what we're doing, ways to look at it, the framework to look at it. And then chapter 2 and chapter 3 is focusing on the Asian world, which is the culture of cultural background and source of the Asian American experience. And so you have to keep that in mind. So we're going to shift now to focusing much more on what's going on in America, naturally, because our class is on Asian Americans. But keep in mind all the stuff we talked about in chapters 2 and 3. And keep in mind also, although we have now shifted to the Americas, but we will still constantly at times go back to Asia, because what's happening in Asia continues obviously to reflect profoundly what happens to the Asian American community here. And we'll do that in some ways, obviously, for example, with the Korean War, World War II, a little farther back, even World War I for that matter. And then the Vietnam War, obviously, and all that's happened since then. So, but not just those conflicts and the new influx of immigrants and refugees who come over to the United States, but what continues to go on in general in Asia continues to profoundly impact aspects of the Asian American experience in many ways. As you guys know, you come from an immigrant background, you still have strong ties to the country of origin. And maybe at a certain point you begin to kind of a split identity, but you still have strong cultural ties there. You care deeply about what's going on. You maybe have family and friends there, relatives, grandparents, mom and dad may still be there. You may still plug in many aspects of that culture while still obviously becoming American here too. So, any case, but now we're going to shift a bit more, at least in this lecture, to what's going on inside the United States. So, although again, we're going to talk about Asia here just briefly, and that is, of course, it's European contact with Asia that is going to prompt the first Asian immigrants to the Americas. And I won't spend long on here. You guys already know this general story, so I'll keep this short and sweet. As you guys know, Asia has many products the Europeans like access to, spices of all kinds, make your food taste better, and more aromatic, all kinds of things. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, peppercorn, sugar, all kinds of luxury items, silks, carpets, fine wool, porcelains, exotic drugs, dyes, tea, a wide range of items that the Europeans like access to. Pepper is just an example of those. So there's an example of pepper growing on a plant right here. It's indigenous only to Asia at that time period. Some places in the Spice Islands, some places today would be India. And the Europeans liking black pepper. I don't know how you guys are, but I like black pepper a lot too. I'm a fan. So I can see why the Europeans want access to it and how valuable and how lucrative it is. And that's just one, of course, many of the products that Europeans are desperate to get their hands on. Now, the Silk Road had given them some of these things, but it's very expensive, and so obviously there's a desire to have much more direct access. And that trade, not just for, of course, for peppercorns, but all those products coming from Asia and resources is going to fuel European desire to get to Asia and begin to trade directly. And that is the beginning of our story with the Asian experience in the Americas. And that really gets going, excuse me, with the Manila Galleon trade as Asia opens doors to the New World. And you see a depiction there of a modern depiction of Andres de Urdaneta. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Or maybe that's not quite close, but close to that. The significance of him is he's the first one who charts the route from what today would be the Philippines back to the coast of Mexico, establishing the Manila Galleon trade, which is going to be a conduit for the first Asian immigrants to the Americas. In this case, to Mexico initially, but to the Americas in general. And you can see his lifespan there when he lived. But as a navigator and friar and following Magellan, now Magellan did this early, but Magellan's going the opposite direction. He's going, in this case, from the New World or from Mexico, and he was going from east to west. He crosses to Asia. Whereas Urdaneta, he's going the opposite direction. So he's charting the path from the Philippines back to the Americas, and say specifically to what would be Mexico, and establishing that route. And the significance of that is the trade that begins to flow from Asia, in this case the Spanish world, across the Pacific and Mexico, across Mexico, then on into Spain. But within that trade, that is the context when the first Asian immigrants that we're of arrive in the New World, in this case in Spain. Now, this begins probably, ironically, probably the first immigrants, perhaps for Filipinos. We kind of think that's probably the case. We don't know for sure. Eric Lee argues that probably the first Asian immigrants are Filipinos. They may or may not have been free. They may have been enslaved or maybe done voluntarily to be on some of those ships, including perhaps I'm going to fix a typo there. Urdaneta's voyage. And some of his sailors being likely Filipino, later on others would be Chinese and for other Asian nations, sailors, slaves, and servants begin to make their way from Asia to the Americas. Now, initially, it's relatively small numbers, but the first immigrants to Asia, from Asia to the Americas, would land there in Mexico as part of the Manila Galleon trade. There's a very early depiction, you see 1570s, and that would be not long, by the way, after the first Manila Galleon under Urdaneta arrives there off the coast of Mexico from the Philippines, just 2 years after his arrival there. There's a depiction from the 1590s, again a bit similar. I chose this image because it shows the natives in the Ladrones Islands and their reaction to Manila Galleon. Those images you see below you show you both aspects of this. So on the left is a view of Manila, which is the departure point for the Manila Galleon across the Pacific, and that's from 1665. Ironically, that's a Dutch view of it, but it's a Spanish city. And then there on the right, this is the terminus of the Manila Galleon. There'd be Acapulco, which you guys know quite well. Acapulco, of course, has been a great resort city in modern times, but its original purpose really as a terminus for the Manila Galleon and its important role it created. So really Acapulco is going to be ground zero of the arrival of the first Asian immigrants to the New World, whether that was voluntary or not, but Acapulco will be the first contact. Oh, excuse me. Wow. Guess I'm tired. Okay, so a couple examples of those very early years. Now, you even have some, it's not just servants and sailors and sometimes enslaved people who are brought across as Asians. Relatively early on, you have a Japanese delegation that arrives in the New World, and that's what you see in the picture there of Hasukara Tusen Nimaga. And I'll do my best with his name. That may not be precisely correct, so we want to have a Japanese speaker clarify that. But and the significance is he's part of a samurai leading an expedition to the Americas onto Europe. And he would land there in Acapulco, travel across Mexico, eventually make his way onto Europe, and then work his way back from Mexico and take the reverse trip on the Manila Galleon back, ultimately returning to Asia. Significance that, though, is even though his stay is temporary, it shows the Pacific reality, and in this case, Asia and the Pacific combining together, and for the arrival, in this case, of an Asian delegation, in this case from Japan, arriving in the New World, or the Americas, and that'll be the beginning of a governmental process of the Pacific nations, in this case in Asia, and the Pacific nations in the Americas, in this case the United States, and that contact of official delegations going back and forth. Now, the statue you see on the right, the image here on the right, that's a statue of La China Poblana. And hopefully I got that correct or close. But the translation of that is essentially the Chinese lady of Poblana. Now, by the way, ironically, and this is a start of theme we'll talk about in more detail, we think she was not Chinese, actually. Now, she was referred to as China or China. But she's not actually Chinese. Actually, she's probably from India. We believe that as a young girl, she was seized as a sex slave by a Portuguese captain in India. Eventually, there's a lot that happens, of course, but eventually is traveled on to Mexico, where she becomes free and eventually becomes known as a lay holy woman, and later on a Mexican icon. The statue of her depicted on the right also shows a very interesting aspect of also cultural exchange, in this case specifically fashion exchange, that her kind of hybrid personal style of combining aspects of Asian clothing, in this case, to be Indian, and perhaps other Asian places that she's traveled with Mexican wear, Mexican traditional clothing, and that her own kind of interpretation of what that has looked like has become a fashion style in Mexico, both of hairstyle and fashion. And you see a depiction of a modern day statue of at least that vision of what she would have looked like, combining, ironically, this kind of Asian aspect. Again, she's from India, but Asian maybe in general, and then Mexican culture, Spanish culture, obviously, because there's Spanish culture too. So all three of those cultural heritage mixing together as interpreted by her, and then also our contemporary ideas of what she would have looked like. All right. Now, there were relatively few Asians initially inside Mexico, but the numbers do begin to pick up. And I want you guys to know this. So if you have pen and pencil, I want you guys to write down. So the first large-scale immigration to the New World would actually what we refer to as Asian Coolies. You have to be careful with that term because some of these terms kind of can be reductive or diminishing the individual identity of individual people. So you don't want to reduce them to like some kind of coolie moniker or description. But frankly, that is the term that would be used for them. So again, we're not saying that's defining who they were. But these are working class people brought to the Americas in sometimes significant numbers to labor. And they come from a variety of Asian nations. Sometimes it would be from India. The photograph you see on the right is primarily an Indian contingent. And that would be in the British Islands of Trinidad and Tobago, taken in 1890. You have a significant number of people also come from China and immigrate to the New World, again, to the Americas. We think in Mexico and into the Caribbean and farther south too, to form various manual labor kind of jobs, sometimes skilled labor jobs that they're having a hard time getting laborers for. Slavery by this time period has been outlawed in nearly all these countries, but they're looking for some fairly low-class agricultural labor to do these jobs. And oftentimes the plantation owners and others are not happy with what they saw is the local indigenous labor. That's a whole separate topic, but they want to bring in a different labor source, in this case, Asians. And they come in as coolies. Now, the status of these coolies varies from person to person. By the way, let me back up for just a second. The map in front of you guys are looking at shows you a map of the world where and when slavery was abolished. Now, in the American context, we naturally tend to navel gaze. Let me step straighter. Tend to navel gaze at the American experience. And justly so, we need to understand the American experience. But if you look carefully around the world, you can see the locations where nations or peoples or regions outlawed slavery in the world's history. Some of these quite early, some of these quite late. For example, you look at Europe, and in general, Europe outlaws slavery quite early. See, for example, France, 1220, it's outstanding. You see there, and that would be Norway, 1274, it's very early. Russia, perhaps surprisingly, but 1723, Russia outlaws slavery. I see different regions around Europe does it quite early. Whereas the United States, as you guys know, it's a mix, right? There are some parts of the United States in the northern states that outlaw slavery earlier, but of course the South is not going to outlaw it until 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, as you guys know. Mexico gets there earlier. You guys see that Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829. See Canada when Canada outlawed it, and other places too. Now, when you look at South America, you can see in general it's quite a bit later, although it depends on South American nation you're talking about. And then more alarmingly, disturbingly, take a look at Africa and Asia. So in those locations, slavery goes on much later. And then you see some nations even grayed out. The reason why they grayed out probably gets kind of complicated, honestly. When slavery was outlawed there is no easy way to pick a specific year. For example, this region right here would be the Belgian Congo. and there is no specific year attached to it. And I think the reason why it's too complex, you can't just pick like 1 year because that's a complex region, and probably no central government controlling all of it, so it's not easy to even pick a year. But in general, take a look at Africa. General slavery is getting Africa into the 20th century. And in parts of Asia, that's true as well, too. You see there, for example, China, 1910. And in Korea, 1894. So and you see in what would be the Dutch East Indies, 1863. You see in Thailand, 1912. So it really depends on what place. And probably perhaps the most disturbing of all, you see some African countries all the way, 1981. And you see Saudi Arabia was 1962. And then Yemen would be 1967. So, yeah. My point with showing you that is you don't need to know all those nations. What you know is to have unfree labor, sadly, is not confined to the United States. Sadly. Does not let us off the moral hook for what we did. I'm just saying, sadly, a lot of the world has grappled with unfree labor of one kind or another. Now, slavery, by the time period we're talking about in class, was in the way out or is proving unsatisfactory for one reason or another. And so European nations begin to look in the colonial system to bring in Asian coolies. So by the 19th century, 1800s, by 1800s, most Central South American countries have or will shortly abolish slavery. Realizing they still need labor, that gets more complicated how to do that. That's when the window opens for a desire for an additional labor source. Now, still they employed the local indigenous people naturally, in one more form of, when I say employed, that may be more serf-like condition, frankly, at times. But they are looking for more access to labor, and that is the beginning of large-scale immigration to some parts of Central America and the Caribbean, looking for laborers. Oftentimes, the term is used as a kind of a general term, which is coolie. We think that the origin of that word actually probably comes primarily out of an Indian term, but it basically means laborer. And it has more than that, it's more connotation. That means more like a cheap labor, easily available labor, and frankly and tragically, probably also kind of exploited labor. A labor that they're not technically a slave, but they're not also completely free either. So because of this coolie system, I want you guys, let me highlight that for you guys. The coolie system has some very strong native connotations with it. What are those? Well, because the coolies at times were in near slave-like conditions. So in these Central American countries or in the Caribbean, where you have these Asian coolies from China, from India, other places, although technically they're not slaves, but you'd be forgiven if you thought they were. And by the way, there are degrees of unfree status that you might define as awful close to slavery. Oftentimes, these Asian immigrants were employed there. Some came voluntarily, some came involuntarily to the New World. So this arouses, obviously, animosity in some Americans who thought we'd finally put a stake in the heart of this terrible institution, which is slavery. But now these Asian coolies, not blaming them per se, by the way, but the existence of them and those who are using them is through the back door, bringing in another form of unfree labor that sounds awful close to slavery and wanting to put a stop to that. Now, the downside of that is oftentimes conflating or mixing the idea of Asian immigrant with coolie status is let's solve the problem by getting rid of the coolie status, by getting rid of the Asian immigrant. You can see why there's overlap of problems there. Additionally, typically the Asian coolies are paid very low wages. Now, why does that matter? It's not those who are treated as coolies. It's not their fault, of course, right? But they're being poor laborers. But oftentimes the other people there, European colonists and others who are also working in that same nation or area, we have a lot of resentment because they feel like wage-wise we cannot keep up with these Asian coolies because they're paid at a very low level. We can't afford to live like that. And so there's deep economic resentment oftentimes toward these Asian populations. Even though, of course, the Asian population want to make more money too. They're not okay with their wages, right? They've probably been in some ways perhaps trapped or duped into this or had no options back home. So it's not that they're okay with their wages. So ironically, the resentment toward them has really nothing to do in this case with these Asian immigrants, but their identity as coolies and their pay as coolies makes them a center of resentment for many who feel like we can't compete with this. Additionally, dehumanizing conditions that these coolies often are treated with is going to reinforce the idea that Asians are somehow different from us. Maybe we couldn't do the same labor exploitative practices to white people. By the way, they did sometimes, but maybe since we couldn't, but since they're Asians, somehow they're different and not like us. And this state of submission and exploitation that they live in, that is somehow perhaps a part of who they are, that they live that way. And so there's the white population at times, it might just be white, could also be, white gets a little complicated there too, because this could be other ethnic racial groups too. So it's not just white, but the existing racial groups there and ethnic groups already may view these Asians as a negative arrival who brings like another form of unfree labor, and their judgments about them as the racial cultural fears are also directed onto the actual Asian coolie themselves. See what I'm saying? So for all these reasons, the idea of Asian coolie brings up a big negative backlash. And it could be for a variety of reasons I just mentioned. But the downside, of course, that for the typical Asian person, of course, they're not going to identify as a coolie, nor is that their aspiration. But they're part of this exploitative workforce who's working like this. But oftentimes they're the target of economic fears, resentments, culture fears, sometimes racial fears, and their degraded kind of condition as a coolie intensify that negative treatment. So why does all this matter? So the specter of this coolie labor is going to fuel anti-Asian feelings in the United States, even though, frankly, the coolie system of labor was not employed in the United States. Now, we had slavery, you guys know, but we did not have this Asian coolie labor system really stabilized inside the United States. But its reputation from the Caribbean, from Mexico, from Central South America, is going to precede the Asian experience in America in a negative way. And so it's going to color perceptions of Asian immigrants in America. For example, the Chinese working on the railroad will be perceived as coolies, although in fact they're not coolies. But that's not really their work arrangement, not as coolies. But the American perception, which already is quite negative from these other locations, will be added on to that part of the Asian experience. So, okay. Now, how about to North America, or in this case, the United States? Now, there are some individuals who did come over as individuals, and you can read about them in Erica Lee's The Making of Asian America. Some individuals came over quite early, 1820s, 1810s. You had individual Chinese or others who come over, but you don't have any large-scale immigration until the gold rush era in California. That's really the jumping off point for any level of significant Asian immigration in the United States. So that's where we're starting with the gold rush. There's a quote there from an announcement in China during this era, and there's apparently a typo there. There we go. Okay. All right. See, Americans are very rich people. They want the Chinamen to come. Money is in great plenty and to spare in America. Now, obviously, that's an advertising poster. And there's probably a Chinese corporation making money facilitating this transportation of Chinese to America to make all this money easily available. It's not easily available. But that perception that it can be is fuel for some Chinese who, because of dislocation, war in China, China's going through a lot during this time period. There's some Chinese that feel like perhaps America is my ticket out of poverty and the chaos that China's going through, and this may be a way for me to better my own personal lot and for my family as well too. So they take the risk and cross the Pacific to come to the gold fields. All right. In fact, even the Chinese word for California in that time period, Gumsan or Gold Mountain, gives you a sense of the Chinese perceptions of California. The vast majority of Chinese who come to California are from the Pearl River Delta region in China. That's the area, and the general area of A has a very high population. It's in the general area today, what today would be Hong Kong and Macau. It's in the Guangdong province. There's considerable foreign influence there, so you probably should see foreigners there if you were living there. Additionally, you probably see those posters and And you also, since you are close to the coast, the ability to get onto a ship and cross the Pacific probably perhaps seems more doable. Also, just word of mouth. You hear people leaving, going to Gold Mountain. You hear maybe a young man from your neighbor's family goes. You feel like you have no economic prospects, but you heard he's gone. You might be tempted to go too. You see maybe around town, see posters advertising this. You might be willing to try your luck and try your fortune in the New World, in this case in California. Many Chinese, of course, cannot afford the ticket. By the way, the vast majority of Chinese crossing these very early years are people who don't have a lot of money in the first place. There might be some exceptions to that, but many of them, again, they're hoping to improve their economic lot, social standing, by making good money and returning from California, having struck it rich, and return back to China and settle there and get a wife or take care of their parents, build a big house, and be able to enjoy their life back in China with some level of economic security based on the money they made in America. That's the vision for the vast majority of the Chinese immigrants that come. But most of them, when they leave, don't have a lot of money, so they arrive on the credit ticket system. I'm going to highlight that for you guys. The credit ticket system essentially is a person's borrowing money. They don't have that kind of money. So they borrow money to cross, and so your labor in California or America, wherever you end up, part of that is going to be to pay off these corporations, businessmen who gave you that fare across the Pacific in the first place. So the first couple of years, Chinese immigration was fairly small, but increased rapidly to 20,000 in 1852, again, because the belief that you can strike it rich. Now, as you guys probably guessed, most Chinese in the gold fields did not strike it rich, but some did. Some lucky, hardworking ones, they did strike it rich, and so the dream of returning home a wealthy man happened for some individuals. So we don't want to paint the picture that it didn't happen for anybody. It happened for some Chinese individuals, struck it rich. But the vast majority, that's not how it went down. They found it quite difficult. But the same thing for the Americans. Immigrating to the gold fields, the average person, gold fields did not get rich. Now, certainly some individuals did, but the majority, of course, don't. So for the Chinese who did not strike it rich, many of them begin to realize maybe I'm going to have to work here longer or shift gears because perhaps the gold fields is not going to pay my way back home as I imagined it was. So they begin to move into other kinds of businesses, manufacturing, business, restaurants, laundries, domestic servants, agriculture work, all kinds of things. And we'll get to the railroad here in a minute. There's some early depictions of some Chinese in the gold fields here in California. Now, it doesn't take too long before animosity begins to grow toward the Chinese in California. Now, we'll come back much more on that topic, but it didn't take long for animosity to begin to grow. By the way, there are even today some legacies here in California because we're in ground zero for the Asian immigration to the United States, and California is it. You see some remnants. If you take 4, I believe that's 4. Gotta scratch my head here. I think it's Highway 4 on its way up to San Andres, I believe. Or is that 120? Maybe that's 120. I think here for a second. In any case, Chinese camp. Maybe it's on 120 now that I think of it. Yeah, I think there's 120, not 4. I think it's 120. But right off 120 on the way up to Sonora, you'll see a sign next to the highway there that says Chinese camp. That is a small camp, whatever, from the gold rush era. Now, today, that no longer exists, obviously, as a Chinese community. But that is a remnant what we're talking about, which is Chinese arriving and going in those very early days into the gold fields, in the foothills of the Sierra. And our little local reference, a reminder of that is Chinese camp, I believe, right off 120. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad, as you guys are probably aware, is going to be the next great magnet for immigration and work for the Asian community, in this case, primarily Chinese community. That's because, as you guys know, there's a tremendous amount of work required, and the Chinese are going to bring some special qualities that makes them highly preferred by the railroad managers in the construction of Transcontinental Railroad. Why is that? Now, there's some negative, but there's also some positive. We'll get to the negative here shortly, but I want to have a quote from Leland Stanford, who's one of the owners of the Central Pacific Railroad and one of those most responsible for promoting Chinese coming to work for the railroad, and I was quite protective of them and preferring them. And he said, quote from me, writes, "The Chinese railroad workers are quiet, peaceable, industrious, economical. Without them, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national highway. Now, there are also some upside, which he does not mention, but they probably have less rights. They're not U.S. citizens. If there's a terrible accident and some die in labor construction, you're going to have less blowback because they don't have an important constituency politically in the United States to have pushback, for example, for safety standards and so forth, because they're from China, and they're not U.S. citizens. But those other things he praised them as also equally real too. Most Chinese, as you guys know, are very motivated. Their vision is to make money and go back home. They're not in America to, at least initially, to carve out a long-term life there. So the clock is ticking. They want to go back to family in China. And so again, that means steady, hard work to increase your savings to fulfill your goal, which is to go back to China. So they were quite dedicated. Whereas the railroad managers sometimes complain that if you had Caucasian workers, they're not necessarily married to working on the railroad, right? There's other things they can do. By the way, they might drift off, go do something else. They're not tied to that as closely. Additionally, the Chinese tended to be organized in groups headed by Chinese foremen. Chinese foreman responsible for bringing his laborers to the work site in the morning. He's going to some degree control them, keep an eye on them. So it's a much more stable, reliable workforce, whereas the white workers, if they get drunk on Friday night, might not come back Monday morning. And he supported himself. He didn't necessarily have some major goal to go back to some location with the... And if he's got enough money for him to drink and have a good time, that might be enough for him. Maybe he skips work on on Monday and Tuesday. Maybe he's sleeping off a hangover. But the Chinese workers are very unlikely to do that because, again, they're organized under typically a Chinese foreman who's keeping an eye on them. But also they have that larger goal, which is the clock is ticking. I got to get back, as in the early days as they saw it. There's a depiction of some Chinese laborers working on the Central Pacific Railroad. You can see all of them. Additionally, there's more of this story. I don't want to go into it too deep, but Chinese workers tended to get less sick. One reason, there's a variety of reasons, but one of them is Chinese workers drink a lot of green tea, which I'm working my way through here, right, too. But why is that significant? Because you're going to boil the water first before you make the tea, and they drank a lot of that, or drank a lot of that. Whereas a typical white worker might be drinking out of some local stream. By the way, if you're in the Sierras, you drink a local stream, man, that water probably is the best tasting water you can get. If you guys had a chance to be up in the Sierras someplace, and you drink out of some mountain stream, just delicious. But, and here's the big but. But for those of you guys who go backpacking or hiking, you know, just taking a gulp out of any old stream in the Sierras is not a good idea. Again, the water probably be ice cold, crystal clear, tastes delicious. I've done it. It's great. But there's a risk for those of you who are hikers or backpackers and campers. You guys know this. If you drink out of some stream, how do you know there's not a dead deer carcass upriver? You would never see it. And the parts per million of that decaying, rotting meat are probably so tiny you can't smell it either. Could be on just the bacteria level, frankly, but you would not know that. But if you drink that water, you're going to get very ill. But if you're a Chinese worker and you're boiling your water oftentimes in order to make tea, you're protected from that in many cases. So that's one reason, for example, they tend to be more stable because they tend to be less likely to get sick and be ill. Obviously, it's a tremendous amount of work to make this, and although there's many laborers, of course, doing the work, but the Chinese, as you guys know, play a critical role to make this happen. The work is often backbreaking, dangerous, obviously away from home, and they're really away from home, as you guys know. But so it's not easy to fill these labor needs for all these reasons, but the Chinese do an extraordinary amount of work. You take a look at this. This is huge. I want you guys to know this. So, toward the end, 90% of the total workforce were from on the Central Pacific Railroad are Chinese. To let you know, again, not initially, but toward the end, let you know the extraordinary amount of labor they're doing that really ties the nation together, and our tribute to that because, again, that labor makes this possible. This right here is one that cuts to the Sierras. You can see the tunnel they're working on there in the background. If you guys are curious about this, I have a recommendation for you guys. So if you guys ever take Highway 80, take Highway 80 over to Reno, right near the summit of Highway 80 as you're taking that over to Reno, over to Nevada. There's a tunnel there that was constructed during the Central Pacific Railroad's initial construction period. It's still there today. It's not used anymore. That's a tunnel, by the way, you see here on the left. So currently it's not in use, although there's a track through it, but it's not used anymore. I'm not saying it means you and I can walk through it, and I've been through it. It gives you a real direct sense of the history, an extraordinary amount of labor would have taken to blast your way and hack your way through the granite there at the top of the Sierras. And undoubtedly, quite a bit that was done by Chinese, along with engineers and others who are employed by the Central Pacific Railroad to do this. Right, by the way, right after you go through that tunnel, again, if you walk through it, I recommend it to you guys. Right after that, you go across a place called the China Wall. China Wall, which is this rock wall, was constructed to hold up the track, which is right up here, as it begins to work its way slowly, looping its way slowly down into Nevada. Popular opinion is this wall was constructed by Chinese laborers. By the way, that's likely the case. Now, you might have had some Caucasian foremen others work them as well, too. But the reality is probably the vast majority of those stones were laid by the Chinese laborers. And thus giving it its name, which say it's called the China Wall. Again, if you guys are up in the area, I recommend you guys go check it out. It's just off Highway 80, right at the summit there, before you head down either back into California or into Nevada. Right there, somewhere if you get off, you can see the railroad and the work done by the Chinese and others on the Central Pacific Railroad. Now, as railroad work began to decline there, the Chinese obviously began to look for other work, and they began to spread out to western states searching for work. And this map right here, which was created in 1880, shows you the percentage population of where the Chinese were going to during this era. And of course, they're going for other places for labor. You actually see them spread out through the Mississippi and other regions too, but the vast majority of them, based on the darker color in these counties, show the vast majority of them are going to remain on the West Coast, oftentimes in mining, small business, agriculture, other businesses here on the West Coast. Now, we'll get into deeper details on this topic later, but I want to give you guys a sense of the pushback that begins to increase against the Chinese presence on the West Coast. And it really gets going here in California initially. I mentioned California being the ground zero. That's both positive and negative. But you can see here in California the beginning of a very strong anti-Asian push, which will be focused on the Chinese. And oftentimes the term we use is called the yellow peril, once you guys know that term. And we'll use that term in several chapters here, be critical. But basically, it's the beginning of a long anti-Asian racism and fear that turned out on the West Coast toward Asians in general, but initially focused on the Chinese, but they don't move to Japanese. Now, to give you guys a little background to this is, what if you're a Chinese immigrant to America and you come over and work in the gold fields and you do okay, but you don't get wealthy, and then eventually transition to work on the railroad, and again, you make some decent money, but you don't get wealthy. You've been in the United States for quite a while now, maybe a decade. Maybe your vision of going back home has changed, and maybe that's no longer your vision. By the way, some, of course, would go home. But perhaps that maybe is not your vision is to go home now. Maybe you decide, I'm going to stay. Can you become a U.S. citizen? Because obviously, if you're going to stay, that's certainly for many reasons something you want to do, all the rights and liberties that come with an American citizen. So that gets us into the topic of citizenship. Who's inside and outside? And this is where it starts to get a bit more complicated and in some ways tragic for the Asian American labor. So I want you guys to know this. The 1790 Naturalization Act is the first nationwide attempt to address what does it mean to be an American citizen? What are the qualifications to become an American citizen? And the answer to that is, sadly, but once you guys know this, essentially the early nation, again, we'll take a look at the date there. The date is, oops, I'll highlight for you guys, 1790. The Naturalization Act in 1790 makes sure the language of this act excludes certain groups. Native Americans, although there are exceptions to that, but Native Americans, indentured servants, slaves, obviously, And free black people could also not become citizens. Now, it's going to be added a little bit more because as the years roll by, this act will be used as an attempt to bar Asians from becoming citizens. Now, by the way, the act in 1790 did not foresee the arrival of Asian immigrants, so the Asian immigrants don't really appear in the act of 1790. That's too early. But the fact that they're kind of defining citizenship, which by appearances appears to be basically white European background, that's your entry point to become a citizen. And obviously from Asia not being included in that general idea means some would see the 1790 Act, Naturalization Act, as a legal constitutional way to bar Asian immigrants. Again, it's not necessarily clear, but the interpretation of the Act would lead some to definitely conclude that Asians are barred from citizenship because blacks are, in those early decades, obviously African American slaves are, many Americans in many cases are. But then it starts getting more complicated. I want you guys to know this too. But Congress, as the years go by, begins to do some things on the flip side. For example, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is signed at the end of the Mexican-American War. That treaty granted citizenship to Mexicans living inside the United States. Now, prior to that probably is more murky, but the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is more explicit, which is no longer is your identity as a person from Mexico barring you from citizenship. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, if you live inside the United States, already granting you citizenship or naturalization. Additionally, black Americans in the 14th Amendment passed in 1868 are granted citizenship. So that early 1790 exclusion of limiting it to free white persons in character, that is beginning to break down some, but somewhat. Again, it's not totally conclusive yet because now African Americans defined as U.S. citizens, and Mexicans who were inside the United States when America took the Southwest from Mexico also defined now as American citizens. Asians so far are not directly in either one of those, frankly. So they're not by specific terminology excluded in the 1790 Act, but nor are they specifically included by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo or the 14th Amendment. So they remain kind of in this limbo condition down to interpretation. Now, as the beginning here in California, will be a series of acts that are going to look to limit or bar Chinese immigration. And the Page Act of 1875 is one of the first legal attempts to either limit or bar Chinese immigration. So what did this do? Well, in those early years, the vast majority of Chinese immigrants were men. Probably 9 to 1, 10 to 1. They actually probably higher numbers than that. Again, many of them, their vision is make good money in Gold Mountain, get on a ship, and go back home. That's the vision. And by the way, some are going to do that. But as the numbers continue, and in those early years, there's very few Chinese women. So the Chinese women that did come came in relatively small numbers. Some of them, by the way, not free themselves. Might come over in various states of being unfree. And some were free, but some of the Chinese women that came over were not free. But many of them end up in prostitution in Chinese communities on the West Coast, in California in particular. So you have some in the Caucasian community who look at this practice of these Chinese women who are prostitutes and brothels, look at this quite negatively, and the perception is that the majority of Chinese women who come in here are likely unfree or sex slaves, and they're put in this industry. And by the way, there's some truth to that. I'm not saying that's even wrong. Now, of course, not all Chinese women fall in this category. Some Chinese women are free. They're coming to join family and so forth. But many of them may perhaps fall into what we consider the sex trade industry, and some of them were not free. So that perception fuels a backlash. Now, backlash maybe has some good parts of that, trying to stop the sex trade industry, but also it's going to be tinged with some racism as well, too. But that's the Page Act of 1875, which essentially makes it very difficult for Chinese women or East Asian women in general to immigrate to the United States. The idea is this will end the sex trade industry in the Asian community inside the United States. And, there's an and, it depends who's signing on this bill, also may have the fringe benefit of stopping more Asian immigration because not starting families, because there's no Asian women, not have Asian family. And so for both those reasons, I'd say the biggest one is the sex trade industry. To some degree, that's real. but also it's convenient for those who are already growing alarmed at what they see as this Asian influx in large numbers of culture and different racial identity and so forth, who worry about that. And this is also useful for them to slow that down. Now, much more impactful, though, that, by the way, that's the beginning. That is impactful, but much bigger and impactful. The one I want you guys to know as well, and I'll highlight this, is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was, and we'll get into the origin of this in another lecture, but essentially, a lot of pressure builds up in California, not just California, but California above all, to bar any new Chinese immigration. Now, it's not to exclude those who are already here, but no more new. And by the way, if you go home to visit, a good chance you're not going to be let back in. So if you're already here, that's to not deport you. But no more new Chinese immigration. And if you go back home, that's probably the nation's doors are probably closed to you. That was not a complete bar to all Chinese immigration, but it was pretty dramatic. Now, if you're family, there's some loopholes around this. We'll get to that later on, too. But it does stop essentially almost all new Chinese immigration to the United States during those years. Now, when I say there's not Chinese immigration, there was. But when new, I mean the people who have not been here before. Now, if you already have family here, there's still the availability to bring over family to join you, wife, kids, etc., relatives. There's some availability to do some of that. So it's not a complete ban. But I'd say for all new Chinese immigration, it's close to complete ban for all new Chinese immigration. You can see some examples from the era of both a favorable depiction and also the racialized aspect on that post on the left that says Uncle Sam kicks out a Chinaman. That would be the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. You can see these Chinese fleeing toward the sea. The idea, we're going to get rid of them and make them return to Asia. Now, in that time period, America is complex. There are some in the large American community that saw this and were embarrassed by this and seen it to some degree for what it is, which is it's racial exclusionism and it's racism as well too behind this, and that's what you see there on the right. In this case, showing you see Uncle Sam's holding a piece of paper that says "Protest against Russian exclusion of the Jews." Russia has a long history, a very sad history of anti-Semitism or hatred, oftentimes violent persecution of the Jews. And the U.S., in a good way, was quick to point out Russia's very poor, sometimes very violent treatment of its Jewish minority. And the U.S. would sometimes complain to Russia about the inhumanity of Russia's treatment of its Jews. That is good. We should have done that, absolutely. But the cartoonist is saying, okay, we might be doing the exact same thing, but have you seen how we treat our Chinese here and the exclusion of them? That sounds uncomfortably similar. Now, we're not saying it's exactly the same. The intensity of what happened in Russia to the Jews is more intense. But in the general ballpark, though, of excluding a minority that you have profiled in a very negative way and seeking to exclude them, sometimes even through violence or legal means, is quite achingly similar to what Russia's doing to the Jews, which you've been protesting against. All right, let's get down to a very important Supreme Court decision, and one that you definitely see on the exam, so take a minute and highlight this. U.S. versus Juan Kim Ark, 1898. And by the way, this Supreme Court case is going to be very impactful. Now, Juan Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873. Now, that's very important. According to the 14th Amendment, if you are born inside the United States, just that, if you're born inside the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. Juan Kim Ark is born in San Francisco in 1873. Okay, so far so good. But when he returns to, I should say returns, that's not quite. When he goes to China, because he's not been to China, he's born in America, he's an American citizen. When he goes to China to visit relatives and so forth, when he comes back to his nation of birth as an American citizen, at San Francisco, he's denied entry back in the United States, with the rationale is the Chinese Exclusion Act, as you guys know, right? So he's denied re-entry into the United States and said, sorry, those things don't apply to you. And let's get more specific. The 14th Amendment, which I want you guys to know, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees you, if you're born in the States, you are a U.S. citizen, irrespective of race. The 14th Amendment does not apply to you. And by the way, I'm not saying that's true, but the immigration officials told him that sorry, and the top immigration official on the West Coast The United States told him, "You're Chinese. The 14th Amendment did not have you in mind. Now, it does not specifically exclude you, but you are not in mind. The 14th Amendment does not apply to you as an Asian person, as a Chinese person. Sorry, you cannot come back. Well, come back in. You cannot enter the United States." Now, fortunately, Juan Kim Ark knew his rights and did not sit idly by with this incredibly subjective and wrong analysis. And Juan Kim Ark gets a good lawyers, argues this. This goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1898 issues a critical ruling. And despite some other bad ones, he's going to win this court case. The U.S. Supreme Court says he is a U.S. citizen. Does not say in the 14th Amendment, if you're Asian, the 14th Amendment, does not apply to you. There's no provision in the 14th Amendment. It says if you're born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. Thus, he wins his case and is admitted back in the United States. His case is a landmark for other Asian Americans who are born inside the United States. Because the Chinese Exclusion Act, later on I'll get to the Japanese Exclusion Act and things too, they denied them the ability to become a U.S. citizen. But very importantly, if they had kids in the United States, their kids are automatically U.S. citizen. That's going to play a really big, important role moving forward. We won't get that in this lecture here, but going forward. So you have parents who, even if they want to, in most cases, cannot become a U.S. citizen. It's not legally possible for them, but they have kids. The kids are U.S. citizens, which is an important legal protection to some degree for that family. We'll get to more of that later on. But again, U.S. versus Juan Kim Ark, a very critical, and in this case, a surprising good news in this case. U.S. Supreme Court said, 14th Amendment, where you're born does not matter on your background. That's why it shows Lady Liberty holding a little Asian toddler or baby, and that's because that's what that encapsulated in that Supreme Court decision, which is it protects you. Are you included in the 14th Amendment? Yes, you are. You're born here, citizenship. All right. Now, again, this is a big topic. We're not going to get into all this, but I do want you guys to know. So Chinatowns here, the Chinese, for a whole variety of reasons, tend to congregate together. And you guys know all kinds of reasons. Familiar to culture, language, safety, companionship, ease of cultural communication, relationships. All those make sense. So for all those reasons, business opportunities as well too. Chinese, when they're able, would congregate in areas which are often referred to as Chinatowns. They vary in size and duration. Some of them are temporary. Some did not last. Some are forcibly, sometimes even violently ended. Others of them thrived in those early days and all the way down to today. A good example would be Chinatown in San Francisco, which is the oldest of all these, probably most prestigious, and it existed continuously from its early days and the gold rush all the way down to today. Some of them, again, were quite small. I showed you guys China Camp there in the foothills, not too far from Jamestown and Sonora. I think there's probably no Chinese live there today. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So it's a historic reference for what used to be there. There you go. I want you guys to know San Francisco Chinatown is really the parent of this concept, both in size, influence, importance, and longevity. And the things that take place there will also be an important part of it. It's economic development, social development. It's political organization. It's unionization. The Chinese secret societies also grew up there in San Francisco. It's regional associations. All those are going to be a part of the Chinese community. And what I want you guys to know is the various relationships within Chinatown. One of the most important organizations that we refer to as a Tong. The Tong is basically a brotherhood that's modeled off secret societies of triads from China. And a Tong essentially is joining an organization that hopefully has your back, provides some assistance, some help, might perhaps provide you a job, someone to go to for help with socializing as well too. And also they have some repercussions for you, not repercussions, some obligations for you as a member of that Tong too. But all those things means you're part of a group, and now you have some protection being part of a group. Now, controversial, the Tongs, some of them were involved in some practices the United States viewed quite negatively. For example, the opium business, gambling, prostitution, and sexual slavery. Some Tongs are involved in these things. So the Tongs can kind of think of them almost in a way like, it's not a perfect analogy, but almost like again, this doesn't work, but only partially. Maybe like a Italian immigrant or an Irish immigrant arriving in New York City, maybe being brought into Italian American organization or Italian or Irish American organization. That organization wants you to vote a certain way, but they'll probably provide you a job, some kind of security, a place to stay, at least initially. They're going to help you, but also they want something from you. And your organization may be involved in some illegal activities, or may not, depends on the organization, of course. And that is the Tongs. So Tongs were oftentimes viewed by the larger American community as quite negative because they see some Tongs being involved, for example, in gambling, perhaps prostitution as well. The Chinese community, again, which is very heavily male dominated. And so oftentimes in the American community, they saw Tongs, I want you guys to know this, so highlight this, as a purveyor of vice. Again, the gambling, the prostitution, other things that take place. And so for the general American public, perhaps not familiar or not sensitive to immigrant concerns of the Chinese community, are going to view the Tongs in a more simplistic way of black and white. In this case, black, which means bad, and they see these negative things they believe the Tongs are up to. There's some early depictions of some Chinese immigrants. That is in San Francisco from 1885 there on the left. And also a young Chinese girl, also in San Francisco. We don't have the precise date. You can see 1895, 1900. She's wearing traditional Chinese dress, including her little shoes there. As you can see there, her headdress. Some more examples of from San Francisco, both on the left and right, the young Chinese girls there. But you guys notice what it says. If you look carefully, it says rescued slave girls in Chinatown. Yeah, they're probably trafficked. Again, the good and bad about this is I hope they were rescued from what likely would be called sexual slaves. On the flip side, of course, but this reinforces negative perceptions that may be placed on all Chinese. Because, of course, some Chinese men are not going to participate in the sex trade industry. Of course, many of them would not, but some did. But when you have these raids of rescue girls, again, which is a very good thing, but the larger community hearing the news of this may extrapolate this sex trade industry and extrapolate that for the entire Chinese community and judge them accordingly. Some more images from the California Chinatowns, kind of both sides of that. On the left, you see women in opium den in Chinatown. That's from 1900. These women, again, may or may not be in free status. Opium is obviously a controlled substance, a way to check out and it's a drug, of course, you guys know. These women may be in non-free status. Again, what that means exactly, could they be bar girls? Could they be prostitutes? Perhaps. And I don't know. So I'll be careful making that supposition. But that's a possibility. On the flip side, you have other aspects of the Chinese community that are thriving too. Now, that's much later in time, as you see, but this is a young Chinese American girl operating a switchboard from the San Francisco area too. That is the depiction of San Francisco Chinatown today. Some of you perhaps have been there. I recommend it to you guys. Now again, we have to kind of give you, we don't want to get the idea that that's encapsulation of Chinese culture, but it is a lens of the Chinese experience in America and a lens of the Chinese experience from China as well too, visiting San Francisco Chinatown. Chinese immigrants, we'll get to the end of this lecture, played a major impact in America's agriculture, especially here in the Central Valley, doing all kinds of things, Sacramento and San Joaquin Delta. A lot of the dikes and canals constructed there and levees, a lot of that was done by the Chinese and later by the Japanese too. If you guys drive, say, Highway 4 through Fairfield, head that direction, or through Stockton on Highway 4 over to Fairfield and stuff, you'll go through a lot of areas there that were land that in many places reclaimed from a swamp status. A lot of that manual labor was done by Chinese, later on by Japanese, who were doing a lot of that backbreaking work to construct levees and canals, that whole system there. And also a lot of the agricultural work was done by the Chinese. I'm going to give you an example of that. I'll highlight that for you guys, by the way, if that's important. There you go. So take a minute and write that down. All right, last few things here as we're getting close to the end of this lecture. Chinese immigrant and their impact on everyday things around us that we take for granted. One of those would be the Bing cherry. So the Bing cherry is in part a legacy of the Chinese agricultural labor here on the West Coast. As you guys know, Bing cherries are fabulous. Now the backstory of that, which I want you guys to know, is a combination of American agricultural ingenuity combined with a Chinese agricultural ingenuity, and both of those combining together. So the Bing cherry is a product of Seth Lewin, this gentleman here on the left, and one of his Chinese agricultural foremen, a man named Bing. And the two of them in combination are going to give birth to what is the Bing cherry. Now, the difficulty is this story coming from the 1870s. It's a little hard to know all the details, frankly. So you have to go a little bit on what family and grandkids said about what took place. But historian scholars' best estimate is as follows. Now, Seth Lewin is a quite accomplished agricultural researcher, thinker, and he's working on new brands of cherries, trying to crossbreed them and so forth. And in combination with his head foreman, who is Bing. And Bing was his head foreman on his in his orchards where they're working on this new, basically hybrid cherry. Now, Bing is doing a lot of the direct care, and also his expertise and being the foreman knowing a great deal about caring for orchards and cherry trees additionally. That the combination of this new hybrid created by Seth Lewin and then the agricultural expertise additionally added by Bing combined together to give birth to this brand new variety of cherries, which they refer to as the Bing cherry. And according to that heritage, in gratitude toward Bing's labor in the orchards and his specific help with this new breed of cherries, that Seth Lewin names this brand new cherry variety after his head foreman on his farms, Bing. Thus the origin today of the Bing cherry in recognition of the critical role played by the Chinese laborers, in this case one individual in particular, in the orchards and the creation of the Bing cherry. Now, sadly, we don't know more of the story. Bing himself returned to China not long after this to visit and never came back. We don't know what happened to Bing. Perhaps, to some degree, his vision was fulfilled. Perhaps he was planning to go back to China all along, or perhaps while he was there, things intervened. We just don't know, unfortunately. But I do want you guys to know that, again, that's a current day connection to the past, the impact of Chinese labor, in this case, agriculture expertise, combined with the American experience, too, to produce something that we love every summer. All right, last few things here before we get to the end here. Anti-Chinese riots and massacres. So, Eric Lee states by the 1870s, there's been considerable and growing anti-Chinese activism on the West Coast. Above all in California, but not limited here in California, and this breaks out in many places on the West Coast. Oftentimes through violence. Chinese communities will be attacked, sometimes through violent riots, and the Chinese either expelled or pushed into a small part of that larger community. And you're looking at the Rock Springs massacre right there by white miners, and this is from a Harper's Weekly illustration, which was from 1885. The one I want you to know, though, and perhaps the most famous of these, was called the Chinese Massacre 1871 in Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles 1871 is still a fairly small community. And the Chinese community there was also quite small. It's not big at all. But some of the issues at Chinatown, which I mentioned earlier, and I won't go through all the details here. You guys can Google this yourself and get more details. But some of the issues the Chinese community are going to spill out, combined with the general American white hostility or fear of the Chinese community, is also going to spill out in tragic results. So, in long story short, there was an inter-Chinese conflict over a Chinese woman, probably, by the way, probably a woman who's in the sexual industry who's not free. So she escapes from a brothel. There's different versions of this, but escapes from a brothel, is captured by some other Chinese to return her. They torture her partly. Eventually, she's escaped. She did survive, but she's abused. And by the fact that she's in the sexual industry in the first place means she's unfree. And she's escaped, she's seized, and so violent. But over that context between these two Chinese organizations, there was some inter-Chinese violence over possession of her or rescue of her. in that you had a Chinese man taking a shot at another Chinese man, and this is going to fuel. So what happens is in that violence, a white person is shot right here. So a policeman and a rancher have been killed in the conflict between two rival Tongs. Remember the Tongs. Remember the Tongs could have positive, but they could also have some negative aspects. Think of organized crime. So in the inter-Tong violence, a policeman and a rancher are both shot in LA. And that fuels, by the way, now obviously the community might be very sensitive about that, but what happens next shows you the nature of the anti-Chinese feeling. Because in a civil society there, things being equal as they should be. And according to the Constitution and to the law, what should have happened, obviously, is they should immediately look at who are the people in the Tong who shot the rancher and the policeman, and arrest them, charged with murder, go through due process. Are they guilty? If they are, they meet the punishment of the law naturally. That's what should have happened. And hopefully also the young woman in question being rescued. If in fact she's in the sex trade industry, which she probably was, to rescue her and save her from that life. Okay, that's what should go down. And maybe investigate what the Tongs are up to. Also makes sense. But that's not really what goes down here. What goes down to is an enraged white populace hearing that policeman rancher has been killed by this inter-Tong rivalry decides to enact immediate vengeance by attacking Chinatown in LA. In the process, they killed 19 Chinese people. 15 of them, or after they were killed, were later hung. And it's sometimes referred to as the largest mass lynching in U.S. history. I don't know whether I'd term it, but it doesn't really matter whether you call it a lynching. Lynching, usually the person's alive, but it could be. It could be a lynching in a sense because they're tracked down and beaten to death or killed in one way or the other. And that does have, to some degree, a hallmark of what a lynching is. Now, I'd argue maybe lynchings are slightly different, but does not matter. Massacre is equally as powerful and equally abhorrent, because that's certainly what it was. It was a violent mob massacre of any Chinese to get their head on. The fact that they did hang some of them, now that does play into the definition oftentimes what we think of as a lynching. So, is it both massacre and lynching? Yeah, I suppose that would probably be the best way to describe it. Most of them have been shot to death before they were hung, but not all of them. Some of them were mutilated by the mob, looking for souvenirs. In one case, one Chinese person had a diamond ring. They cut his finger off to get access to that ring. And the Chinese community is devastated by this. Now, there was some post this very violent assault on the Chinese community in LA. There were convictions of some of those who were involved in these murders, these very violent murders of Chinese. Again, many of them had zero to do with what had taken place. This angry mob surges into Chinatown and goes wild in the beating, attacking, and killing. Some of them were convicted, but later on, these convictions were all overturned upon appeal due to technicalities. So, long-term, justice is not done for the Chinese community of Los Angeles. And, of course, that would not be the only time where justice is not done for a crime committed by the majority, in this case, white population, against the Asian minority, in this case, the Chinese community. There's a depiction from that time period. This is a massacre. That's the Chinese American History Museum there on the left. And then a photograph actually of Chinese corpses or bodies following that massacre or lynching there in Los Angeles in 1872. Yeah. It shows a depiction right there of Chinese officials in China looking across and seeing the violence that's breaking out against Asian American communities, in this case, largely Chinese communities on the West Coast, and saying, what a pretty mess that is, that with what's happening in the Americas toward the Chinese. And again, it's not limited to LA. I mentioned this happens in quite a few communities. This is in San Jose. What you see in the background is the Chinese town being burned. So all the smoke here is flames and smoke pouring off of the Chinese community there in San Jose. And this happens, frankly, throughout the West Coast in many locations. This will be by the end, by the way, of some Chinese communities. They'll never be rebuilt. Now, others will be rebuilt, but others they'll never be rebuilt. They just cease to exist. And we're about done. Last thing is we're wrapping up for this lecture, which I admitted these are kind of long ones, so maybe you do this in two goes. But when it comes to the Japanese who begin to immigrate to the United States in this era, and that begins the Japanese immigration, that would be the Gentleman's Agreement, in this case, to limit Japanese immigration to the Americas. Just as the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 is another way for the U.S. government to limit Japanese immigrant, because the Chinese are excluded, but the Japanese immigrants begin to include large numbers, and we'll get to that a bit later in another lecture. But the numbers of Japanese immigrants begin to increase dramatically. And so that similar growing anti-Asian racism on the West Coast is now directed toward the Chinese community, and the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. By the way, ironic it's called Gentleman's Agreement, but that is not a gentleman's agreement, that's for sure. But that's what it means, is to limit Japanese immigration to the United States. The Japanese do agree to it reluctantly, but that's agreement to drastically limit any new immigration from Japan to the United States. And with that, we're going to get to the end of this lecture. That is plenty, but that is really the origin of the early days of the Asian experience in the Americas in the 19th century. Of course, it starts much earlier than that, as you guys see there. Now, Erica's lead textbook has much more detail. If you want to get much more into the early Chinese immigrant experience and the Japanese immigrant experience, her first 4 chapters can give you much more detail. But for the sake of this lecture, we better wrap it up right there and stop. So with that, hope all you guys will, and we'll see you with the next lecture. Take care, everybody.